Alright, what's going on guys? Today we're going to be defining the difference between budget decks and jank decks. I feel like this is important because as a budget focused Magic the Gathering channel, I do seem to get comments that seem to be confused about the difference, so I figured I would just define them and ensure that at least my viewers understand the difference between budget and jank decks. So first off, a jank deck is typically a deck that is, well, to say the least, a little bit unreliable. Jank decks typically have a really weird win condition, like they're trying to do some absurd thing that's kind of improbable to pull off, but when it does happen, it's really fun and kind of crazy. Jank decks tend to be weird glass cannon combo decks, or just decks that are built around enchantments with weird effects, or just, jank decks are absurd. That's what they are. They're really absurd, out of the ordinary, kind of crazy decks that do weird and different things. And it's a lot different from a budget deck, because obviously that's the more obvious one. A budget deck is just a deck that has a low total price. If a format has an average deck cost of like $1,000, like for modern, then a budget deck might be $100 to $150, or like in standard, a standard deck, a tier 1 deck typically is $200 to $400, so maybe a budget standard deck is $50 to $75. That's the idea behind a budget deck, is that it's just cheaper. Now without question, there is some overlap. You can have a deck that is budget and also jank, because it can have a janky win condition and it can have a low price. So without question, you can have a deck that is both budget and janky, but they aren't 100% connected, because you could have a jank deck with an absurd win condition that costs $800 in modern. It might be janky and weird and crazy, but that doesn't mean it's cheap. And likewise, a budget deck could be a budget version of a tier 1 deck that is very sort of, well-rounded and, grounded to earth, but is just cheap. So just to give you some examples on my channel, first off, everything's budget. Everything on this channel is budget, but there are some decks that are janky and some decks that are, more well-grounded and not really janky. So for example, on the janky side would be like Abzan Panharmonicon, which required me to get a Panharmonicon on turn 4, maybe 3 with the help of a Mana Dork, but a Panharmonicon in modern, and then I look to capitalize on that with Obsidat and Siege Rhino too. But the idea here was really janky, because the likelihood of getting a Panharmonicon in play without dying is not great, and then the likelihood of capitalizing on it before it dies or before it gets destroyed is not good, so it was pretty janky. Like, it could do some crazy things. If I could get a Panharmonicon in play and keep an Obsidat in play, then it was just obscene. But every time that didn't happen, it was not so good, because it was janky. It could work if it got its pieces, but then it would sometimes just not work. And then on the less janky side would be things like Blast Affinity and Budget Eldrazi and Taxes. These are tier 1 strategies, right? These are Affinity, and I guess technically Eldrazi and Taxes isn't tier 1, it's more of a tier 2 deck, but the point is, these are decks that are legitimate tier 1 competitive decks, and then I just built budget versions. I took out the most expensive cards and replaced them with, just less good, less expensive cards, and built budget versions of tier 1 decks. So they were budget decks, but they weren't janky decks necessarily. So that's the thing, guys. A budget deck doesn't necessarily mean it's jank, and a jank deck doesn't necessarily mean it's budget. A jank deck can be expensive, and a budget deck can be well-grounded and well-rounded. These terms aren't necessarily the same, they are a little bit different, and I feel like people kind of get them confused a little bit, so hopefully that helps you understand. If someone says a deck is janky, that doesn't mean it's cheap. It could be very expensive. It just means that it's kind of bizarre and absurd, and it's built around a concept that maybe isn't the most reliable. And then budget decks just mean that they're cheap. It doesn't mean that they're janky. It doesn't mean they're built around absurd concepts. They can frequently just be budget versions of legitimate tier 1 decks. So yeah, slightly different, just slightly different terms that I feel like people get confused. So hopefully that clarifies it. So there you go guys. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.